Hello. Hello, everybody. My name is Dino Daizovi, and if you don't know who I am, I'm one of the co-hosts of the annual Pony Awards, and that's happening at 6:15 today, so that's where you should all go as well. Other than that, occasionally I do stuff with computers. So first, just to make sure my own personal bias doesn't reflect too much in this presentation, I'm going to do some disclaimers. Contrary to popular belief, I have never worked for Apple. I have a crippling addiction to their hardware, to buying them and playing with them, however, which makes me have to work because I have to be able to afford the shininess. I've never gotten any monetary compensation from Apple, but they have sent me some free swag. And when I broke the free coffee mug that they gave me, I sent a picture of the broken coffee mug, and they sent me a new one. Actually, yeah, I don't think it was me. I think it was this guy. This is actually true. I really have been mistaken by strangers on the street for being an Apple Store employee. I was on the phone and someone was like, actually it was if you live in like a big city like New York, there's like these corners, like these storefront psychics. And so there's a woman sitting on a chair in front of the storefront psychics, and she was like, wait, do you work at the Apple Store? Obviously she was pretty shitty at her job. Some people know me for hacking a Mac once. It wasn't any of yours, so you don't have to worry. Charlie Miller and I wrote a book called The Mac Hacker's Handbook, and I have still never met Steve Jobs, and that was basically the main point for doing it, and of course I blame Charlie for this. Any iOS talk, I believe, should give proper deference to the jailbreak community, because if you're doing security analysis on any of this stuff, you're using all their tools, and literally they did all the hard work. So just about anything that I've done is basically dwarfed by some of the awesome stuff that they've done. Especially, I'd like to especially thank Chronic Dev Team and Comex for releasing awesome tools with full source code so I can play with them, learn about them. And also the anonymous people who are editing and keeping the iPhone wiki up to date, which actually is a great source of documentation on iOS. And there's a bunch of other security researchers who, if you're interested in iOS, you should be following their presentations. You have the guys from Sogeti Institute, and I don't want to massacre their names, so I'll let everyone read it because I can't pronounce anything near French. Dino Blazakis does some work that I reference here, and Stefan Nestor's giving a great talk as well. So what are we going to talk about, and more importantly, how are we going to talk about it? The focus of this talk is somewhat of a departure from most of my talks. Most of my talks are just super deep dives, and honestly, the room is way more empty than it is now. And because usually no one understands what they are, and they're put early in the morning. So this is actually trying to be a little more high level and actually give people information that they actually should use. So a lot of people right now are trying to expand their smartphone support beyond traditional things like BlackBerries. And so they have the choice. Should we allow iOS-based devices and Android-based devices, but we don't really know much about the security of them. So what should we know? And how can that inform our decisions on how we configure them, how we deploy them, and what procedures we take. And so basically what I did is I spent a few months reversing various bits of the OS to try and answer the questions that a large enterprise would have about the security of these devices. And also so I can draw useful comparisons to other competing choices. Like, we keep hearing about all these remote jailbreaks for iPhone. That means it's obviously more insecure than Android, right? Well, in my opinion, not really. And I'm going to try and explain why. And I'm also going to talk about a number of implementation details and internals of the operating system. To give a little background on, basically that's the evidence for my assertions on their security, and say, well, I looked at this, and it compares to this, and that's why I think this is good or why this is not good. And if there are any reverse engineers or vulnerability people in the house, a few, no one really willing to admit. If you like tinkering with things in binary, there might be, there are some things that I'll point out, but you might have to pay a little bit of attention because I'm not going to be like, yo, check this out. But there might be some interesting things there. So what we're going to talk about, give an introduction and background on, a little of the security properties of iOS, and I'm going to go through the things that I looked at. I looked at ASLR, code signing, sandboxing, and data encryption. And the overarching theme of this talk is figuring out how susceptible is an iOS-based device to a remote attack, and also what are the ramifications of a lost or stolen device. So if I'm drunk in a bar and I leave my phone and someone finds it, what'll happen? Or even worse, what if someone knows who I am, wants my phone, steals it, and tries to get data off it. What is the stuff that actually is going to be compromised? And if we know how, what will be compromised, we can kind of make the smart decisions on what data we should put on them. So yeah, these are the kind of high-level concerns we looked at. Is there sensitive data that can be stolen? What is the risk of malicious apps? More importantly, what is the likelihood of something like Droid Dream happening in the iOS ecosystem? And if the market share between Android and iOS are in some ways equivalent, in some markets not, there's kind of neck and neck by some counts. Why does one platform see a new attack every couple weeks when the other one isn't? And I'll kind of explain why. And also, so we have to wonder, like, what are the likelihood of remote attacks, or what's the difficulty of a remote attack through the web browser or email, attacking our users? And because these devices are subsuming a lot of the functions of the desktop, are we going to have the same thing with desktops, where we're chasing APT or just malware infections all throughout our enterprise? So how I like explaining the security for something is an attack graph. And the main idea here is I'm trying to pictorially show just how much work I as an attacker have to go through to actually get something of a meaningful effect. And just to make things confusing, I keep changing the format of these graphs. So in this one, if it's a solid square, this is like a position. This is something I have. So we're going to start in the upper left. I have the ability to craft malicious data. And where I want to go is kind of the circuitous route, enforced by the size of the slide. I have to go all the way around down to what I call the temporary jailbreak. This is the iOS kernel running without the security protections enabled. So, and then the white squares in between are the actions I have to take. So these are either vulnerabilities that I must find and exploit, or exploitation techniques that I must develop and leverage, and so on. So, and also this is a way of explaining why I think things like Jailbreak Me are so impressive, because they take a lot more steps than the attacks that we see against desktops. Compared to an IE exploit, or a Mac browser exploit, or even like a reader exploit, the stuff that you have to do to get an actual meaningful effect, like a temporary jailbreak, to be able to do anything else, is a lot more work. So we're going to start at the upper left, cruise around. First thing we can do, we find a memory corruption bug. If you look at the presentations or papers from some security companies, they'll say, there's 1 million WebKit bugs in iOS. I have no idea why they're not getting popped left and right. Well, the reason is because that's just the first node of this graph. Just finding a WebKit bug is not really going to do much. So once you can exploit it, we'll assume that you can do that. You have ROP code execution. But remember, you still have I'll talk about what these are, but you have something called code signing enforcement. So you have to do full ROP. You're not going to be able to just execute your shell code. And once if you say you can get across that, because for instance, there have been vulnerabilities here, like in iOS, I think, or iPhone OS 2.2, Charlie Miller found a code signing bypass, where it was a way to use the VM protect system call to basically let you execute raw bytes. And I was like, well, that's awesome, because that's usually a huge pain in the butt. So that's another vulnerability or bypass that you need. But once you have that, you're still in the sandbox. And so you're still not done. You need to figure out a way to escape the sandbox. And we're going to assume that we're not going to go directly against the kernel yet. So we're going to take the long way. So we escape the sandbox, and we can maybe exploit another process that's not sandboxed. And then we just have unprivileged, unsandboxed execution. And then we can find a way to attack another process that has privileges, and finally we're root. But then, unlike other platforms, if you're root on the iPhone, you still don't really have that much. You can't just load kernel code. You actually have to, even root has to break into the kernel. So we're going to need to do the same thing. We actually have to exploit a kernel vulnerability to get kernel code execution to be able to do anything really meaningful. And kind of the reason that multiple arrows go through the exploit kernel vulnerability node is, a smart attacker is not going to take the long way, they're going to take the short way. So once you have ROP control, you're going to just exploit the kernel directly. So if you can find a kernel bug that's accessible within the sandbox, just attack that. And then you have kernel code execution, you can turn off the security features, and you have a temporary jailbreak. And so you're like, oh, awesome. But that still may not be what you need, because once you've owned a system, you want persistence. So there's a whole other sequence of steps that you need to do to actually get that. So say you have privileged native code execution, which is enough to drop an executable that runs as root on the system. So you'll need to find a few tricks to do that. If you're root, you can overwrite some existing binaries, but what the jailbreaks have done is they have basically dropped like one file that caused another library to get loaded and various other tricks to get a custom executable loaded. But just doing that, you can't actually do everything you need, because you need to make sure that your binary is code signed. So you need a second vulnerability, which is a incomplete code signing vulnerability. This is a vulnerability that is identified and patched, like iOS 4.3.4 just patched a few of the ways that the jailbreakers have been doing this. So this is yet another bug that you find, exploit, gets patched, it's dead, got to find another one. And then you go through the entire cycle of what you had to do for the remote attack of you have ROP and you might need to do other things, but you need a kernel exploit to then finally jailbreak the kernel. And in jailbreaker terms, that's called an untethered jailbreak. So you could do that, or you could try to take the easy way, which is obtain one of Apple's private keys and use that to overwrite the stored kernel cache on the disk. But apparently that first step is a little tough. So I guess that has to be the only reason why the jailbreakers have taken that long way. So let's start going through some of the various components. So first thing we're going to start off with is ASLR. So why do we care about ASLR? What we want to know is how hard is it to remotely exploit a built-in or third-party app? So basically, there's a couple vectors here that are important: a malicious web page in Safari, or a third-party app with an embedded browser like Facebook or Twitter. Because if you use any of these things, any of these services like I do, you click every single link you see. So when I'm on Twitter, I'm just, ooh, yeah, I want to see that. Ooh, I want to see that too. But I want to know, like, how risky is this? Am I going to get owned because I'm just basically a click bot on Twitter? And another vector obviously is email messages, email attachments. Third vector that I think a lot of people are overly more concerned with than they need to is man-in-the-middling and using that level of access to corrupt the network protocol and actually exploit the app. I don't think this is all that important because you basically have a time-based element. You need to make sure they're running the app at the right time. And then it's kind of the hardest type of vulnerability to exploit on iOS for the reasons that I'll talk about. So, to address those concerns, iOS 4.3 came out with ASLR. And I think we all know what ASLR is, but for the people who aren't here, the people watching on the internet, I'll explain briefly what it is. You randomize memory so that when you try and run an exploit, things aren't where you expect. That's basically as simple as it needs to be. iOS 4.3 introduced ASLR support, and because it's iOS 4.3, you need to make sure you have an iPhone 3GS and later. For this reason and for a variety of other ones, you don't really want to run anything earlier than the iPhone 3GS. But to take the fullest use of ASLR, the apps must be compiled with support for position-independent executables. Otherwise, they're only going to get partial ASLR. And luckily, of course, like as we'd expect, all the built-in applications and executables in iOS are compiled with PIE. So it's pretty easy to remember. Pi is good. PIE is also good. So let's look at the address space with PIE. So this is meant to simulate like what a built-in iOS executable will have. And if we look on the far left, we have a column for the executable main segment. Bunch of numbers. They're small, but they're all different. This includes the executable text, the static data, the BSS, all the stuff that's linked to the main executable. The heap, the default heap segment, looks pretty randomized. The stack as well is pretty randomized. If you look, the libraries, they're static until you reboot. So now we know that once you reboot your phone, all the system libraries are now in a new location. So it's mostly random. And the linker also is random on OS 10 and OS 10 based systems, because iOS is just an embedded OS 10. At least with like 10.6 and prior, OS 10 would have the dynamic linker at a fixed location. This was a common way to exploit vulnerabilities, was to use return-oriented programming or whatever based on code in this segment, because it was there and you can use it. So you can see that with built-in apps or any executable compiled with PIE, it's now randomized, so that's pretty good. So let's look at an application that doesn't have PIE support. So on the far left, we can see that the executable is at the same place. That's what we expect. If it does not have a position-independent executable, the executable can't be randomized. But the stack is also at a fixed place. So this is only the stack of the main thread. So that's of limited use, but the way that OS 10 does a lot of their threading, it's an evented model. So most of the code will be running in the main thread. But also we now have that the linker is also at a fixed location. So we can easily see that stuff is not as good if you don't have pi. And just to summarize, if also, actually, I forgot to mention, if you don't have a position-independent executable, you actually have less entropy in the heap. So, but I mean, the way I look at ASLR is you don't really need that many bits of entropy because, if you're doing, any sort of reasonable attack, 50% reliability really sucks. So if you have 2 bits of ASLR, that's kind of enough. So I don't really count the bits or really care. If it has it, it has it. And this kind of summarizes what it is. So let's look at how do we actually identify this. If you have an executable on your OS X system, you can use OTool, which is included with the developer tools, and you can identify whether it has PIE support. If you are SSH'd into a phone, you will, basically you can use the ghetto way of just doing a hex dump and then just look for the right bit in the output. But that's great for the theory and all. What is the actual level of support of PIE in real-world apps? So you are able to actually enable PIE with earlier versions of Xcode. So various versions of iOS 4.3 have been out for a while. Vendors had, or app makers had enough time to to recompile their apps. Let's see, what the ramifications are. And we want to make sure that the important apps that we care about have PIE. And this is very similar to with Windows. People are constantly talking about, well, this app doesn't opt into ASLR or DEP, and it'll be 5 years after Microsoft releases the Vista that all the apps that you use on your desktop are actually complete. Let's see if iOS, if app makers can actually beat the Windows desktop timeline. So if we look at the important apps we care about: Facebook, Spotify, Songify, Happy Theme Park, Movie Quiz, Cracked Screen, I don't remember that one, Makeup Girls, and the IC Maker. We want to see, just to be purely scientific about this, I took the top 10 free apps on a particular day and identified whether they have PIE support. And I hope it doesn't come as a shock to everyone that IC Maker doesn't have PIE support. Personally, I consider it a pretty serious threat vector, but that's just from its use, not actually any security ramifications. And I could have done this with the top 10 paid apps, and that would have run all of probably $20 or $30, but I'm cheap and I'm a consultant, so if it's not being expensed, I just eat at Taco Bell. So I didn't do that, just the top 10 free apps, because that's what most people install anyway. So what do we need to remember from this? First, Dino has an obsession with the IC Maker app, and he's probably spent more time playing with it than he wants to admit. But the more serious ones are that all built-in apps in iOS have full ASLR, good. So all that stuff is good. Third-party apps, rarely going to be compiled with PIE, and I didn't really want to sit down and go through 100 apps or write a tool to actually do it to find out that none of them actually use PIE. What that's going to mean is that the static location of DOILD will facilitate return-oriented programming and other code reuse-based exploitation techniques. But to put this in perspective, the vast majority of apps, I really don't believe this is a problem, because I think with mobile what we're going to see is that the larger vector is not remote attack, it's privacy. That basically poor encryption of data, things being lost, a lot of this stuff, that's what you're going to find in most of the apps. And do I think that any of these, do I think that someone's going to exploit an OG bug in Spotify? Probably not against iOS, because the amount of control you have over a binary file format like that, combined with the even limited level of ASLR and code signing enforcement, all that stuff, and the sandbox, makes it a lot worse. But any app that includes a browser control, like the UI web view, those are higher risk. So something that has, something like Twitter, Facebook, anything that just embeds that, if it's not compiled with PIE, I think that is a slightly more realistic vector. It's at least slightly easier, and also that you have the benefit of user targeting. So someone can become Facebook friends with me, send me a link, knowing that, of course, Dino just admitted to being a total click monkey. I'm going to click it, and they obviously can guess what device I use. So, I'm pretty easy to target for that. But there are some better protections, and let's talk about code signing, which is actually basically my favorite feature area in iOS. And the stuff we're concerned with here are the authenticity of the application. We have some random app that I downloaded. Can it be trusted to run on my device? Because we have, if you've been using computers for a while, me, I've been using them for about a week and kind of figured them out. We're used to saying don't run suspicious software, so we're intrinsically suspicious of random software. Even if we download it from the App Store, we're going to be like, I don't really know if I should run this. I'm not sure if the IC maker is really going to run off with all my data. But one of the things that it appears is trying to be done in iOS, and actually if you look at Google's native client, native apps are kind of going the way of web apps. That running a native app on your device will be no more risky than running a web application through the browser. Because, running a web application through the browser is totally safe, right? So, if we have the app sufficiently sandboxed and limited through other means, eventually I think they're going to go to a level of risk parity. So, at least in the meantime, what we want to know about the person who made an app is who is the person that wrote it. And I don't mean Joe38@yahoo.com. I want to know a real-world entity. And this is either a person or a company and so on. So that's part of the information I use to verify the trustworthiness of this application. And the other thing is, does it have any hidden functionality? Is someone going to, is this app going to change what it does at runtime and potentially target me as a user? So for instance, one of the attacks that I'm concerned about is that someone is going to, say someone wanted to compromise my phone, and they knew they weren't able to get me through Twitter. One thing they could do is they could make a wildly successful iPhone app that involves throwing birds at sheep. Which one is it? I don't remember. And basically get that on everyone's phones, and then once I actually download that, because everyone wants to run Angry Birds, they say, oh, this is Dino's phone. For Dino's phone, I'm going to do something special and actually pull this stuff out. So we want to make sure, or pull my data out or attack me or something like that. Because that's a realistic threat vector that I've actually heard people say. So we want to know if this application has any hidden functionality and make sure it can't change itself at runtime. So to prevent both of these, or to allay both of these concerns, iOS has code signing. And there's two variants, what I call mandatory code signing and code signing enforcement. Mandatory code signing is kind of a static form. This is what happens to make sure that every binary that you run or application that you run has a proper signature. And this is something that we've seen on other systems, so it's pretty familiar. But iOS also has something that I haven't seen anywhere else, and that's code signing enforcement. And this happens at runtime. And this is kind of, I think, one of the more poorly understood features of the OS, and I am not immune from that. So how this works is, or what this enforces is that processes may only execute code that has been signed by a valid signature, but that happens at runtime. So you can't just create a new page of memory and run it. You can't modify an existing page of memory and run it, because doing so invalidates the signature. So this is much like, if you're familiar with DEP or NX on other operating systems, this is a much stricter policy. But first, let's talk about mandatory code signing a bit. So the mandatory code signing model involves things that were all, certificates. We all know what certificates are, blah, 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 blah. But the other kind of pieces in play are provisioning profiles, signed applications, and entitlements. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how each of these come into play over the next few slides. One of the important things about the iOS developer model is that certificates identify a real-world author. So if you want to be an iOS developer, you actually have to have your real-world individual identity verified or your company identity verified. So I got a certificate for my company. I had to send in the articles of incorporation and all that jazz to verify that I wasn't just making this up. And then after doing so, Apple will actually issue me a certificate and gives me my very own piece of the application identifier namespace that identifies everything that I've made. So that's my little piece of real estate in the app ecosystem. But if I want to run my code on a device, there's another piece that I need. And this is a provisioning profile. And this is a XML blob that must be signed by Apple. And what it does is it tells an iOS device that it is allowed to run software signed by another certificate. Because by default, the devices are locked down. They will only run software that has been signed and blessed by Apple in some arcane ceremony with frankincense and so on. But if there's a provisioning profile, the device will actually trust the certificate there. However, one of the interesting things about this is how it ties into the entitlements security model, where, as I'll show on the next slides, the Apple can bestow the right to give other entitlements through this profile. So it says, all right, you can trust this certificate, but you only can trust the certificate to do these things. And that might be access only these keychain items, or allow itself to be debugged, and so on. And it also will only give rights to a specific device. So when I'm acting as a individual developer, the profile is tied to a specific device. So just getting one of these doesn't mean that I can load code on everyone's device. However, if I get an enterprise certificate, I can use that for code on anyone's device without having to pre-configure. And there's a difference between development and distribution provisioning profiles, because distribution profiles won't actually let you debug. So you can't, if you're actually going to distribute an app, Apple won't let you sign it in a way that the iPhone will let it be debugged on other devices. So only if it's on your own device can you actually debug the application. And what are they? Provisioning profiles are just an XML blob, and basically we can kind of see some of the information here. It's got the identifier prefix, date, when it was created. My certificate was taken out because I don't need to show you guys a big block of base64 data. Unless, can anyone decode X509 base64 form in their head? A little rusty these days? Yeah, you've gone soft. But the most important thing you want to see is this entitlements array. So what this gives you is this lists a number of things on the rights that this provisioning profile may bestow on other applications. And the one that you want to see here is get task allow. So everyone in here understands mock internals intrinsically, right? We all know how that archaic operating system works. So in mock, the task port gives you full access to the task. So this entitlement says that applications signed by this certificate that's in here it can be debugged. It means that other tasks can get access to its task port. And it's not giving these applications privileges to debug other applications, because that's a pretty heavily guarded privilege, but this allows you to be debugged. So this is a development provisioning profile. And so because it's a development provisioning profile, it's locked down to my device. So if you want to see, so you basically have what's called a UDID, unique device identifier, that identifies only my device. And no, I was not dumb enough to put my real UDID on the screen. That's MD5 or random data. Yeah, and so on. And there's a time to live, how to cache it, so on. But the important things that we want to keep in mind are the entitlements and the provision devices, because that tells us the type of provisioning profile it is, and how powerful it is. There's 4 basic distribution models. On-device development is just, we can load a code on our own device and test it. There's ad hoc distribution, which is meant for beta testing, where you can give up to 100, load your code onto 100 users' devices. The one that we are all familiar with is App Store distribution, upload it to Apple, goes on the store, so on. There's also in-house distribution, which allows large organizations to write their own custom apps and distribute them. But the kind of important distinctions here are how many devices they can actually be deployed to. So because Apple has to sign the provisioning profile, this lets them enforce which devices can be provisioned. So ad hoc model, you can only provision up to 100 devices. So if I want to give my app to 100 different people, or say I want to attack Charlie, just to get him back for attacking me with his SMS bug a few years ago, I would need to know the UDID of his phone, give it to Apple, and say, hey, I want you to let me run code on Charlie's device. And then I need to get him to run my application, and then he's running my app. But at the same time, Apple knows that I've been doing this, it's all been logged and all that stuff. So it's not exactly the ideal attack. If I can get my hands on an enterprise certificate, however, that means I can send my code to any device. And so these are increasing or more important, and they're more important, and also they're more difficult to get. You probably have to be like an enterprise that Apple's heard of. But the question is, how do I get my code on the user's device? It's a pretty far stretch of a social engineering attack if I say, all right, I want you to run this great app. And what you need to do is you need to download it from here, my web server, drag it onto iTunes, sync your phone. That's not exactly going to yield many targets. It also is a little inconvenient for testing. So Apple has this thing called over-the-air app distribution. And this is actually useful for, usable for ad hoc and in-house enterprise provisioning. So we can see that this is kind of opening up a little bit. What I can do is I can host my application on a web server and then send a manifest file, a manifest plist, send a link to my targets, and if they click it, it'll get installed. However, they will get a cancel and allow dialog, so it's not exactly silent. But if I have a stolen enterprise certificate, what I can do is I can say, stolen enterprise certificate for, I don't know, Ford or someone, who knows who. And then I can start spamming out users over email, SMS, or a link on a web page. Even though there are some dialogues, chances are I'll probably get a few. And so I'll have my app installed on a few users' phones. But we'll talk about a little later why that's not exactly all that useful. But once they click the link, they have to say, yes, I really want to do this, and so on. But let's talk a little bit about how code signing actually works. So if you want to look at code signing, the real thing to look at is the Apple Mobile File Integrity kernel extension. This is the main thing that is responsible for enforcing the code signing policy. And how it does this is by installing hooks into the Mac framework to give it kind of policy enforcement decisions at various times in the process life cycle. And basically, if there's a few hooks I'll talk about that are used for the mandatory code signing policy, and a few others that are used for the dynamic code signing policy. The rest of dynamic code signing is actually implemented in a virtual memory system. So to find out how this works, basically you just need to go through the kernel sources and see it's actually tied into the paging system. But I'll talk a little bit about process status. So here are the actual hooks that you'll find if you look at Apple Mobile File Integrity. The first one, which is the most important for mandatory code signing, is vnode check signature. What this normally does is it just checks, I have the second column is the description of what it should do based on the description from the Apple header file. And on the right is the description of what it does based on reading the code in the kernel. Just disassembling the iOS. Wait, did I just admit to breaking a EULA? I mean, divine inspiration. This is what I assume they do. So if you look at what AMFI does for check signature, it's going to, it basically needs to decide whether or not this binary should be allowed to be run. And there's a couple trust caches. And I'll talk a little more about what these trust caches are because it's a little interesting. So what it'll do is it'll check what's called the CD hash, which is a hash of the code directory. It's a little simpler than checking a full signature. And if it's in the trust cache, it says, yeah, I've seen this before, I've verified it, go. If it's not, it's actually going to do an RPC call to a userland server to actually do the full decision. There's also a flag that'll actually just say, all right, let everything go. So if you're wondering how to jailbreak a running kernel and allow yourself to run any binary, all you need to do is there's this nice global called AMFI, get out of my way, and you hit that and you're good. Apparently now with the software development, things like what are they called, Easter eggs, and kind of displaying senses of humor are kind of frowned upon in software from big companies. However, it seems like Apple has kindly allowed developers to have a sense of humor in things in the iOS kernel. So if you look through a lot of the names of variables, you'll have things like ICANN has debugger and things like that. So it's kind of refreshing when you're looking through binary for hours on end to find a little bit of a sense of humor in there. So the second hook we need to know about is check exec. So this will figure out should I allow this execution to happen, and since the signature's already been checked, the policy is already enforced. We don't need to really check anything else there. But what this is going to do is set a couple code status flags, and these are CS hard or CS kill, and these actually kind of form the main status tracking and enforcement for dynamic code signing. And what these are is CS hard says this is a hard address space. We're not going to let you load any new memory, new executable memory into it. And kill means if for some reason we become invalid, we're going to forcibly kill the process. So that's, if you've kind of done some playing with iOS exploitation, you'll often run into the CS kill because you can change some things and then you try and change the page permissions back, and then boom, process goes away. Check get task, I talked about the difference between development and distribution provisioning profiles, and this is actually where that's enforced. And so to determine whether the subject can be identified or can be debugged, it's going to say, does it have the get task allow entitlement, and for the target of the debugging request, and the source must have the task for PID allow entitlement. And you'll see these entitlement checks a lot when you're looking through the security model, or a lot of the security enforcement for iOS, because this is sort of unique to iOS and OS 10 a little bit now. But this is how they have their own security policy that's not the standard Unix user-based model. A fun one, another hook is the run CS invalid. So this, if you're looking at being able to inject code into a process, what'll happen is if you do that, the code signing will become invalid. And at that point, this MAC hook is checked. Should the process be allowed to run invalid code? And so what it does, what this kernel module does, is it checks the entitlements of the running process, and there's a few here that'll basically allow it. If it has run invalid allow, get task allow, run inside code, if it has any of these entitlements, it'll allow it actually to run unsigned code. Because you need to be able to run unsigned code to be debugged. So if you have the get task allow, which allows you to be debugged, you can run unsigned code, which is why your exploit might work in the debugger, but when you try it in on a real phone, no dice. There's also a userland process that the kernel will query with an RPC call saying, hey, should unrestricted debugging be enabled? If so, if that daemon returns true, if that RPC call returns true, it'll be allowed. There's also this other interesting one called check map anon. I'll talk a little bit more about that, which is just determining whether the process should be allowed to map anonymous memory with the specified flags. And I'll leave the rest as a punchline. So let's look at what the code signatures actually look like. So here's the code signature for iBooks. It kind of looks about as we'd expect. There's a certificate chain, starts with the Apple root CA and has a few certificates there. And as the optimization, we have the CD hash. We have the hash of the code directory. This kind of makes sense. But if we go and look at the code signature for one of the built-in binaries on iOS, we're actually going to see something different. And so, for instance, does anyone remember what is actually missing in this version? So if we look at this version, we have something. This one's shorter. We're missing something. The entire cert chain is gone. So if you see this, you'll be like, wait. It's allowing this signature this binary has no cert chain, just has a hash. What's going on here? And this is what's called an ad hoc code signature, and it just has the CD hash. So we're going to be like, all right, well, let's figure out, how is this okay? Because I don't think being able to just verify by hash should be all that valid. So what happens is the iOS kernel has a number of caches of these CD hashes. So the first one is what I call the static. Well, I call it, but kind of based on strings in the binary as well, the static trust cache. The iOS kernel, for each version of iOS, has a huge table of the CD hashes of all the binaries that are on the system. So basically, to verify, just checks the CD hash in that table, we're good to go. But there's also a method that allows at runtime, the userland process can load a new trust cache into the kernel and say, hey, actually, I'd like you to trust these hashes as well. And I call this the dynamic trust cache. However, at first glance, this will look like this is a pretty big gaping security hole that you find this method to call and you can just now run arbitrary binaries. However, this must be in a signed IMG3 bundle, which basically means it must be signed by Apple, so it's not really going to help you. The third thing that this code will do is look for a RPC call, or do an RPC call to a user mode daemon to actually do the full signature verification. And everything that has been run on a system since it's booted is actually stored in a linked list that I call the MRU trust cache, because it's most recently used. So if, for instance, I don't know, if somehow you're doing live memory forensics on an iOS device and you want to know every binary that's been run, you've got a nice linked list of every single one. So that's kind of interesting. So I actually was looking at the presentations by the guys from Sogeti, and they actually inspired me to try and make some flowcharts, because they'll have flowcharts for incredibly complex, like some of these processes, and I'm like, these actually might be useful to try and explain what's going on here, because Apparently, bullet points on PowerPoint, or sorry, on Keynote slides are not exactly the most effective way to communicate. So I just did both. So basically, this is exactly what this routine does. And if you're visually inclined, you can read that. As you can see by my color schemes, I'm not really a visually inclined person, so those don't really help me very much. Like I mentioned, there's a userland daemon that the kernel will send requests to actually make some of these decisions. And this is called AMFID, for the Apple Mobile File Integrity daemon. There's only 2 routines in the RPC interface for this. There's verified code directory, which I mentioned on the previous slide. That's what we're going to call. RPC call to verified code directory. And the other one is permit unrestricted debugging. So you see that and you're like, oh, that'd be cool. How can I figure out how to get this to return true and allow me to debug anything on the system? Well, what it does here, to find out if unrestricted debugging should be allowed, is it goes through all the installed provisioning profiles, checks for a special Apple profile with the device ID of the device you're running on, and if that's there, if Apple has signed a special profile with your device ID, you can do it, which probably not very likely. So we're going to need to figure out ways to actually bypass the code signing. And that means that basically this is I'll call it a security barrier. The security lawyers in the house might argue with me. But if it requires exploits and those exploits get patched, it's a security barrier. And so what the jailbreak utilities do is they actually include exploits to do this. And they call them incomplete code signing exploits. And the typical way they do this is they'll find a list of function pointers in a data segment that are used but are not covered by the code signature. And so they can actually use that to ROP. So if you overwrite those function pointers, do a stack pivot, do all that stuff, you get code execution. But again, you're going to need to do pure ROP and then exploit the kernel directly so you can turn off jailbreaking and all this stuff. So even one of these just simple untether exploits can be fairly complex. And apparently a lot of these are fixed in iOS 4.3.4. So we'll see how long it takes. I think Stefan Esser's doing the untether exploits these days, so we'll get him started on that, see how long it takes. What I think is more interesting than mandatory code signing, however, is code signing enforcement. And what this is this is the runtime, the dynamic runtime security to prevent injection of random code. And the interesting thing about this is, a lot of people say like, well, the iPhone doesn't have DEP, it doesn't have NX. Well, it's because they don't really advertise. Because they don't have those features. They have dynamic code signing, which is much, much stronger than any of these implementations. However, the interesting thing about this is I don't think this was initially designed for security. This is something to preserve and prevent the application from changing itself at runtime, and also kind of to preserve the business model. It just happens to also prevent the injection of shellcode. So this is one of those situations where your data security is kind of piggybacking for free. But if we want to take a look at this and see how this works, here's where I'd start. There's a system call called CSOps that lets you interact with the process code signing state and query it, do a few things. We can get the status, set some flags, and get a little metadata. The operations we have, these are all from the kernel headers, pretty easy to find, pretty easy to play with. But the fun ones are CS hard and CS kill. And yeah, so basically if you query the status on something, you can say, all right, is this process still valid, or has its memory space been corrupted? That's what CS valid is meant to show you, CS hard, and so on. Those are more if you just want to play with it. But what CS hard is, as I mentioned before, is this is a stronger version of DEP or a WXOR memory page policy. This means that nothing can, CS hard means that no new executable pages can be loaded. So if you actually try and call something like mprotect and say, all right, I'm going to change the protection to this memory page, and I actually want to give it the executable bit, you're just going to get permission denied, no dice. CS kill is a more interesting one that will, the kernel will forcibly kill the process if it becomes invalid. If you're looking at stuff, you'll find that, hey, I can mprotect like a loaded library and make that code writable and make changes to it. You're like, oh, you're getting really excited. You're like, I might be able to find a way to get my exploit to work. And then you're like, all right, well, let's give it the executable bit. First thing you'll try and do is make the page RWX. Well, that'll just fail because you can't make any RWX pages on iOS. But if you say, all right, well, we'll be smart. We'll put it back to the original permissions, just readable and executable. If you do that, then the signature gets checked on the page. Boom, your process gets killed. So no good. However, there's something new in iOS 4.3. So once iOS 4.3 came out, I was kind of looking through this, some of the new features like I always do, because whenever something new comes out from Apple, I basically can't get any work done for about the entire day. And one of the things I noticed was just-in-time compilation of the JavaScript engine. And because I kind of was like, I know basically how code signing enforcement works. I'm like, you can't generate new code at runtime. But if Safari can generate new code at runtime, there has to be a way to do it. So let's see what it actually does. And this is where we look at the entitlements blob that is actually embedded into every binary. So the LDID program you can get it from the jailbreak tools. We'll dump out the embedded XML entitlements, and you can see what privileges different executables have on the system. Because, like I said, a lot of the security policy enforced by iOS and various components in the kernel or other services rely on these entitlements. So if you look through these, you can kind of see some interesting things. But the one that we're interested in right now is the dynamic code signing entitlement. And Safari is the only executable on iOS 4.3 that actually has this entitlement. So there's obviously something special about it. And if we go back to our list of MAC hooks, there's one for check map anon. And the description is, should this process be allowed to map anonymous memory with the given protections? And if you read the code and look through it, what it does is it checks, does this process have the dynamic code sending entitlement? If it does, allow the process to run. So boom. Now we know how Safari does it. So say in the unlikely event that one is able to exploit a WebKit vulnerability in Safari, and we want to, instead of having to do full ROP, we want to actually just execute shellcode, we have an idea of how to do it. So basically, that's what the dynamic code sending entitlement does. There's some mention of it on the web, but I think in general, in the security world, not many people have noticed it. But we don't have to worry too much because only mobile Safari actually has this. So if you embed a web browser into your app, you're not going to be able to do this. So it's going to run your web browser, and especially the JavaScript, will run a little slower. My sort of bottom line on code signing enforcement is that it's actually a very strong defense, and especially combined with ASLR, it is much stronger than what you'll find in just about any other kind of consumer operating system. And that is the combination of code signing and ASLR basically makes just getting an exploit to do what you want, a pretty formidable task against iOS. And sorry, excuse me. I mean, it's not perfect, but what it does makes the attacker have to work extra hard. So instead of being able to requiring a full ROP payload to do everything in ROP, have to write a ROP compiler, spend all this time writing support for conditionals and loops in your ROP compiler and your ROP tools, you can just now execute shellcode by just making a simple ROP stage, which is just like what you do on a desktop OS. And when I look at the fact that this came out in iOS 4.3 along with ASLR, you kind of have to keep in mind that this is sort of like a risk transference. ASLR takes away risk. This adds a little risk to the web browser. But overall, in my opinion, you're about in the same spot. All right, so let's look at their sandbox. Here are the things that we're concerned about. Say I download an app, whatever app that looks interesting at the time. I want to make sure that malicious app, if it's a potentially malicious app, it can't access or modify data belonging to another application. It can't access any of my user information that's potentially sensitive or that I consider sensitive. And I also don't want it to obviously break out of the sandbox and rootkit my device. And one of the benefits here is if you remember I think it was the Skype vulnerability on Android. Skype didn't actually correctly manage the permissions of its files. And so other applications were able to just read your Skype username and password and then steal them, well, we'll talk about why that's not possible on iOS. So the iOS sandbox is based on the same core technologies as the OS X sandbox, and probably the best look into this was Dion Blazakis' presentation from BlackHat DC this year, where he reverse engineered the binary format for the sandbox and for the regular expressions, and wrote some awesome tools to decompile them. So all I basically did was update his tools to make more sense out of the iOS 4.3 profiles. Because what I'm interested in mostly is like, what can I do from the app sandbox, or what can I do from the Safari sandbox? Because I want to see how hard it is to break out of it. In contrast to OS X, iOS only supports static built-in profiles. So on OS X, you could write your own profiles with a scheme-like language, compile them, and actually run them. On iOS, it's just what's built in is all that's there. And when you start a new application or a new executable, there's an entitlement called seatbelt profile, and that tells you that tells the kernel what profiles to apply. And so this is all enforced in the sandbox kernel extension. And like a lot of the other security enforcements, it uses the MAC hooks system. So, sorry, what do the MAC hooks do? They actually have a sort of binary decision tree structure in the kernel, and when the MAC hook needs to make a security decision, it just evaluates that tree to get the determination. And a lot of these are fairly simple. They're just looking at, does the file name match this regex? Is the target of this signal itself? And so on. And if you look to the kernel, you'll find all of these sandbox profiles for the built-in applications. There's a table with their names, and they each link to to the binaries profile. Just dump those bytes to disk, pipe them to Dion's SBDIS, and you'll get a textual representation of the profile, and you can actually see what it does. And so you'll get these for the background daemons. You'll see that the sandbox profiles are enabled for a lot of the the client-side apps that you'd be interested in, Mail, Safari, and all that. And then for third-party apps, there's two profiles, Container and Container 2. Container is the one that we're most interested in because that's what's applied to all third-party applications. Apple is special, so they get Container 2 for iBooks. And so this is essentially the same as the main container profile, but it gives it a little more access to the DRM stuff to be able to apply that to the iBooks. So let's look at how the third-party apps are actually restricted. Every third-party app has a dedicated portion of the file system that is either called the container or the app home directory for the first time it is installed. If you uninstall the app, reinstall it, it gets a brand new directory. And we want to look at, can an application escape out and can it read the data on another one? The home directory has fairly simple structure. You have the app bundle. This is static and this is signed. So the appname.app is fully signed. If you can't write to it, because if you did, you'd invalidate the signature, but the sandbox also enforces that. Application-specific data that is meant to be created by the user and restored and backed up is going to be the documents directory. Libraries just support stuff. You have preferences, caches for stuff that should persist across reboots or across whatever, but doesn't need to be backed up. Temp for stuff that doesn't need to be preserved at all. And if you look at the container profile, so if you look at the white paper for this, you'll see I have a I have a 2-page table that summarizes the entire sandbox policy. And if you want more detail than that, in the source code tarball that has like the source for all the tools and all the stuff and a lot of supporting data, you'll get the actual decompiled profile so you can actually try and see exactly what it does. But in summary, the things that you need to know an application can and cannot do is that by default, it can't do anything. But it can, it's file access. It's generally allowed in the application's home directory. Some exceptions to that, but you can kind of just assume that it can do whatever it wants to its data. Of the user's underlying data, their songs, photos, videos, it can read that data. So any app can upload your photos to some other server. Not a big deal. It can read and write the address book. If you base most of your security analysis on headlines about pwn to own, the fact that an exploit can read the address book, you might think, oh, that's really horrible, but that's essentially all it can do. It can read and write the address book, which could suck, but your stuff is probably backed up to the cloud or somewhere else, so it's not too big a deal. But if we're looking at how to break out of the sandbox, there's two areas that we want to actually focus on. These are IOKit user clients and mock bootstrap servers. So IOKit user clients are like a way that a driver can add sort of an object-oriented interface to a userland daemon. So basically, this allows any kernel extension to create a new kernel attack surface, and both of the last two jailbreak me's exploited vulnerabilities in IOKit user clients. The reason is because those were user client. That was part of the the attack surface allowed through the sandbox. And if you look at the actual profile, it'll be like 8 to 10 user clients that you can talk directly to. And if you can find any vulnerabilities in those user clients and get kernel code execution, you can turn off all the security on the system. But one of the other things that's sort of surprising is that all the mock bootstrap servers are allowed that you can talk to. So mock bootstrap servers are sort of something specific to OS 10. These are just the equivalent of local RPC. But if you look through all the servers that are available, there's 140 different interfaces that a third-party app can talk to. So how many of you want to bet that there's not a single error in any of those 140 interfaces with an average of 10 to 20 subroutines in each of them? This probably might be something. So there's a risk of these being exploited over RPC. So if you get code running in Safari and you want to escalate privileges, you might be able to hit those. However, I don't think that's much of an issue because those RPC servers are going to run in a background daemon. They're going to be significantly harder to get code execution out of over the RPC interface. That's a fairly difficult exploit, significantly more difficult than a client-side exploit even against iOS. So I don't think that's as much of an issue. But what I do think there's a risk of is allowing apps to perform what I'll call unauthorized or undesirable actions. Because with all those interfaces, there's a greater chance that there is a sort of an authorization hole there. And if we look at the servers, there's a bunch of stuff that we can talk to that might be interesting. So the pasteboard, this is for cut and paste, probably not all that interesting. Springboard is the main user interface to iOS. That's the thing that lets you move the apps around and so on. Mobile file integrity, we talked about that before. That's the daemon that lets you, that supports the code signing system. FairPlayD is what enforces DRM, so you can talk to that. If you're of the destructive bent, that second one from the bottom, you're like, oh, I want to see what that one is. Mobile obliteration. That actually is coincidentally the name of a band I played in high school. And the last one, iTunes Store Daemon, was the name for my band in high school that we scrapped because it didn't have nearly the same ring as mobile obliteration. But if you look through the entire list, and in the source code and in the white paper, I've got the table of all 140-ish daemons, and there's a lot of interesting things there. And if you look at one of my previous presentations on auditing mock RPC, I called it hacking at mock. You can see I outlined the procedure for opening one of these up with IDA, identifying the interface, and going through and auditing the whole thing. So obviously, I didn't have the patience to go through and do that for all of them. So how do I wrap up sandboxing? The bottom line you need to keep in mind. Remote exploits are most likely able to break out of the sandbox by going for the kernel, and most likely through the IOKit user clients, because that's new code, it's binary, it hasn't been audited as much as the BSD source code and so on. That's where I think the highest risk is. Any rogue application would have to do the same thing that a remote attack would have to do. Break out of exploit the kernel and jailbreak it. It's always possible that an app will repurpose one of the kernel exploits from the jailbreak developers, and they might be able to use that and just kind of obfuscate the code, hide it in their app, and get past the app review process, but we don't know. Apple's review, I'll say, will most likely catch this. I don't have the guts to try, so I'll just assume they do. However, if you combine this with OTA app distribution, say I'm able to compromise an enterprise certificate. Now, if I can get you to install an app, and you're not, get you to install some random app, and you're not fully patched, I can just take one of the exploits from the jailbreak tools, drop it in that app, and now I'm actually getting somewhere. So now I actually would be able to use that to get full control of your device and actually do something bad. Let's talk about the last subject area to talk about is data encryption. So I think we all know what encryption is for. But what we want to know with the phone is what data is encrypted, So what data is encrypted, in one way? How much data is actually protected by the passcode, and how hard is it to crack these passcodes, and what are our options for attacking them? So what's protected by the passcode? How can we actually break them? And so this actually section is somewhat short because I did a lot of this stuff in, I don't know, November of last year or so. But in the meantime, a much better presentation by the Sojeti guys at Tack in the Box Amsterdam. They went through in amazing level of detail on how all these things worked. So if you want to see the exact specification, details on where the keys are stored, how they're generated, the awesome flowcharts on how how the logic proceeds for a lot of things, check out their presentation. It's really cool. But for the high-level view, I just want to answer what happens if I lose my device? What will someone have to do to compromise it? So here are the different layers of encryption for your data on your phone. First, the entire file system is encrypted at block level with the file system key. And you'll notice that when you power on your phone, it boots up without actually asking for your passcode. So you have no pre-boot authentication. It needs to be able to read the file systems before it actually prompts you for that. So that kind of gives you a hint that the key is stored somewhere, and it's actually stored on the flash. And it's encrypted with a key derived from the UID key. And I mentioned at the bottom what the UID key is. That is a key that is derived from a kind of a device-specific key. So when I'm talking about it's protected by the UID key, what that means is you can't take it off the device. That's based on an AES secret key that's in the hardware AES accelerator in the system on a chip. So unless you're really good with hardware, I'm really crappy with hardware, so I can't even imagine how to do this. I would probably just drop the chip in an acid bath, go off and do something else and forget about it and wonder where the chip went. I don't know exactly how to get the key out, but I haven't heard of anyone else being able to do it. So we'll just assume you can't get it off the device. So anything protected by the UID key is pretty solid. So that means that the key is protected, but we can always use the device to decrypt it. So if we boot up the phone and actually use the phone to decrypt it, we can get it. And that's been publicized in a number of attacks on the iPhone 3GS and later. And this is only used for the file system metadata. So this is just an underlying key that encrypts the file names and is also used for other data. But if all I have is this, all I can see are the names, timestamps, and all that stuff for the file system, and the directory structure, and so on. I can't actually read any data. And that's because every single file has a unique encryption key for it, stored in a file system extended attribute, and that's protected by a class key. The way that data protection works is there's multiple classes of data, and even the no protection class actually has a key for it. So if I don't know how to take these out of what's called the key bag, I can't decrypt any files at all, even though they may not be protected by the passcode. And some of the class keys are actually protected by the passcode, and that gets derived, or there's a key called the passcode key that's derived from the passcode used to encrypt those. And finally, the last layer of encryption is that certain keys are also encrypted with the UID key, so that you actually have to be on that device to decrypt them. So data protection API is the thing that we're most concerned about, and this is how an application designates to the OS that this file or this keychain item must be protected specially. And so by default, things aren't encrypted with the user's passcode, but if the application opts into doing it, they can protect the file with the passcode or the key derived from the passcode key. And with keychain items, you can also say, I want this to be protected with a passcode, and I also want to make sure that you can't migrate this item onto another phone. So if I lose my phone and get another one, restore from an iTunes backup, or say I crack the password to an encrypted iTunes backup, or get access to the plaintext one if you haven't encrypted it, that key won't be recovered. So what the application has to do is opt in to actually designate something as having more protection. So we know once the facility is provided by the OS manufacturer, all the app developers of the world form a thundering herd trying to actually make the fullest and best use of this facility. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And unfortunately, I'm told that Apple Store employees are not supposed to say unfortunately. Instead, they say as it turns out. This is what I read. This is what I read on Mac Rumors. So, as it turns out, not even throughout all of iOS is data protection turned on. So it is primarily used only in the mail application. And so what that means is all your mail messages, attachments, and indexes and metadata for that are all going to be encrypted, as are the passwords that you use for mail accounts. However, not for your Exchange accounts. In order to preserve remote wipe, basically the Exchange passcode can't actually be encrypted. So yeah, that's all it's used for. And also the little screenshots. When you hit the home button and the screen shrinks, those are also encrypted using your passcode, so they're actually nice and strong. But that's it. Unless the third-party application or even something else uses its own crypto, that's all that's going to be encrypted. And if someone finds your phone, they can pull all that data off. So that's kind of an important bullet point here. But we also want to know how strong is the passcode? How hard is it to actually crack it? So, because that'll give us data to those last email messages and so on. The basic way to do this is jailbreak the device and start attacking the passcode directly, because as I mentioned, it's encrypted with the device key, so you have to attack it on the device. But this is a good thing, because what this means is that I can't take a hash off of the phone and crack it on my entire botnet. I have to only crack it on the phone. So that's something to keep in mind here. But if you look at the user interface about the wipe and the forced device wipe and the delay after an incorrect guess, that's only enforced by the user interface. So if we talk directly to the Apple Key Store kernel extension through the IOKit user client or through the framework, we can actually just brute force the keys as much as we want. And on a jailbroken device, yeah, you just do that. And the rate at which you can do this is, I did the math on my own phone. It was 9.8 guesses a second. So what that means is that we can actually make an intelligent, a recommendation on how long your passcode must be based on how long it'll crack, how long it takes to crack, not just something we pulled out of the air. And so, on the default, 4-digit simple passcode, 18 minutes. So I find your phone in a bar, load my tools on there, boom, 18 minutes later I have all your data. So that's not so good. But with a six-character alphanumeric password, that just takes about 8 years, which is pretty good. So if you do what I do on my phone, which is 8-character alphanumeric and complex, it'll take 2 million years, because I'm in security, I'm paranoid. But this will tell you for a couple different policy recommendations how long it'll take to crack, and you can say, all right, the data on my phone is not useful after 8 years, so that's good. So in conclusion, 6-character passcodes are probably sufficient unless the attacker can take the key out of hardware. But most serious in my mind is that data protection is much more limited than most people expect. And the facility is good, but the coverage is not where I'd want. And I personally want to see what iOS 5 covers. And also, if you're using any third-party apps that contain sensitive data, you're going to want to audit them to see what they actually, if they use data protection or not, because chances are they probably won't. Also, because the iPad 2 and later, and assuming the to-be-released iPhone 5 or iPhone whatever's, they don't have, the iPad 2 didn't have any public boot ROM exploits. So that means if I find your iPad 2, I'm not able to, even if you have a simple passcode, I can't load my tools on there to crack it, because I don't have access to the jailbreak tools to do it. So yeah, something to keep in mind. So let's kind of review some of the findings here. Pi is good. In-house distribution certificates are much more powerful. If you can steal those, that's a win. Dynamic code signing will weaken Safari a little bit, but with ASLR, it's kind of roughly equal. And the 140 mock RPC servers are a fairly big aperture. I just went over those, so I'll go back. An important question is, how does this relate to Android or BlackBerry? How do these compare? Data protection and content protection with BlackBerry seem roughly analogous. However, iOS's data protection isn't nearly as good coverage as BlackBerry's. BlackBerry's web browser is based on the same WebKit core as Android's browser and mobile Safari, so you could use the same vulnerabilities against all of them. However, on BlackBerry, you have no sandbox. So once you get code executing, you can do a lot more. And also, Android has no ASLR or NX, so it's much weaker app isolation. Root can load kernel modules. So once you get root, you can just do whatever you want. So I think it's much weaker in most regards. There are a couple things about iOS that are unique to keep in mind. Dynamic code signing is something that is strong. You won't find anywhere else. The kernel is designed to be secured against user mode code. Even if you have root, you still have to exploit the kernel. And with jailbreaking, basically, keep in mind they take a lot of exploits. Look at the jailbreak means they take 3 exploits: a Safari exploit, a kernel exploit, and a code sending exploit in order to implement it. So it's a pretty serious amount of work. And if you look at even with the tools being released, if someone fully jailbreaks their phone and so it's actually at a weakened state, you basically have about the security feature implementation that Android does. So that is the worst case scenario. Here's what I think you should worry about. Worry about a lost, stolen device, repurposed jailbreak exploits, or a stolen enterprise certificate, like for the reasons I mentioned. Basically, use iPad 2 or later is what I recommend. And my final recommendations: look at iOS 5. Hopefully, DP API is more thorough. If you're using any apps with enterprise data, make sure you audit them for use of data protection. Prefer the iPad 2 and later devices so that they don't have any known boot ROM exploits. Use MDM. Don't let your users jailbreak, or you may as well have just given them an Android. But there is one more thing. Actually, it's more of a hobby. Actually, I haven't started, so it's more of a preview. So there's this thing called the iPhone 4. It came out last year. I think you've heard of it. It's pretty cool, and apparently it changes everything, but not just everything, it changes everything again. And being a security researcher, I'm a total fame whore. And most people know me for hacking Macs. And if you look at the Google Trends, Mac is kind of staying stable, but the iOS searches or just our iPhone searches are just going through the roof. So I was like, I should really change what I'm up to. And so I wrote this book called The Mac Hacker's Handbook with this dude, Charlie. You might have heard of him. And he also wrote this book called Fuzzing, or On Fuzzing. I don't really do much fuzzing, so I don't really do it very much, but I thought I'd give it a try. And I was like, hey, why don't I fuzz the iPhone? Sounds like a good idea, but I actually had one concern. Fuzzing the iPhone might make it explode. So I had another idea. Apple came out with this thing called the Apple TV, a revolutionary new device for the amazing low price of $99. And even better, there's jailbreak tools for it. So what did I do? I built this. This is the iOS fuzz farm in my apartment. And what did I do? So let's do like the economics here. So I went to the Apple store when the Apple TV came out, and I was like, hey, do you have any Apple TVs? And they're like, yeah, we have some in stock. I'm like, how many? And they said 4. And I said, okay, I'll take them. They're like, you'll take one? No, I'll take them. And so still wasn't that expensive. 4 Apple TVs, a small switch, a power strip, $500. Totally headless fuzz cluster that I can access over SSH. It's perfect size for operating out of small New York City apartments. But it's nowhere near operational. It's nowhere to write a lot of the iOS test harness, some mechanism for testing GUI iOS apps. But I thought I'd give you a little preview on what I might be presenting on at some point in the future. So for updated slides and white paper, you can go to my blog. You can hit me on the Twitters, because if you send me a link, I'll click on it, or an email where I'll do basically the same thing. Yeah, thank you.